They say money buys comfort. But in first class that day, comfort had a color. Tiana stood perfectly still in the aisle, calm on the outside, fire on the inside, her red suit igniting the cold white silence around her. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't even angry. She was simply standing, boarding pass in hand. Seat 1A. But somehow, she was the one on trial. "Please don't make a scene," the flight attendant said. Her smile soft, her tone sharp enough to draw blood. Every head turned. The silence in the cabin was thick, a quiet theater of privilege watching her humiliation unfold. You could feel it, that electric pause before chaos, that split second before car crash. And there he was, the man in her seat. Tall, white, navy blazer, the kind of face that never hears no. He swirled his champagne slowly, deliberately, eyes never lifting to meet hers. He didn't need to. The flight attendant was already fighting his battle for him. "They probably bumped you to coach, sweetheart," he'd said earlier. Not to her, but through her, like she wasn't even real. Now, as he leaned back with a smirk, the truth hit harder than turbulence. And in that moment, Tiana Brooks realized this wasn't about a seat. It was about who the world thinks deserves to sit in it. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches you, make sure you subscribe because tomorrow, I have saved something extra special for you. Have you ever been judged before you even opened your mouth? What do you do when the people in charge, the ones in uniform, have already decided you're the one who doesn't belong? The hush inside Gate A17 of Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, just minutes earlier, had carried that quiet arrogance of money. It wasn't loud. It was a weighted silence, where first-class passengers moved like they owned the very air they breathed. Then came Tiana Brooks. Her name was a whisper in the halls of Wall Street, a name that made titans of industry pause before they spoke. She walked through the terminal with a calm, commanding presence, her red power suit cutting through the sea of muted grays and navies like fire and snow. Her assistant, a young man with a permanently stressed look, trailed a step behind, whispering urgent updates about the upcoming board meeting in New York. Tiana wasn't just another executive flying first class. She was the CEO of Brooks Global Holdings, a black-owned conglomerate that had just pulled off the impossible, outbidding 3 of the largest tech firms in the world for a billion-dollar federal contract. That kind of win doesn't just make you rich, it makes you a target. It didn't sit well with a lot of people, and as she was about to find out, some people simply cannot stomach seeing a black woman holding that much power. The moment she stepped onto the aircraft, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. A tightening in the flight attendant's smile, a few pairs of eyes that lingered a second too long, the silent question hanging in the air. Does she belong here? Rows of luxury seats, meant to be symbols of comfort, suddenly felt like invisible cages, where stays judged more than any words ever could. She ignored it. She'd spent her life ignoring it. She navigated the plush aisle to her seat, 1A, front row, the best seat on the plane. And there he was, the man in the navy blazer, Charles Denton, sipping champagne like he was born in that chair. "Excuse me," Tiana said, her voice calm and level. "I believe you're in my seat." He glanced up from his glass, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe in a dismissive, insulting appraisal. It was a look she knew well, the look that questioned her credentials, her income, her very right to exist in a space like this. "You must have read it wrong, sweetheart," he said, the condescending term dripping with false charm. 1AS not coach. A few nearby passengers let out quiet, ugly chuckles. They were witnesses, but they were also a jury, and they had already reached a verdict. The flight attendant, a woman named Linda according to her name tag, scurried over, her expression a mask of forced helpfulness. Tiana simply held out her boarding pass. "My ticket says 1A. Linda's eyes darted from Tiana's face, to the confident smirk on Charles's face, to the glittering Rolex on his wrist, and finally, to the boarding pass in Tiana's hand. She took it, but it was just for show. Her mind was already made up. One uniform held more weight than years of achievement. One person looked the part, and the other, in her eyes, clearly did not. "Let me see," she said, her tone patronizing, as if speaking to a confused child. She glanced at it for less than a second before handing it back. "There might be a glitch in the system. Why don't you wait by the galley and I'll see what I can sort out?" "There's nothing to sort out," Tiana stated, her voice still quiet, but now edged with a firmness that was impossible to ignore. "He is in my seat. I'd like him to move." That's when Linda's practiced smile fell away, replaced by a wall of corporate procedure. She said, her voice dropping into a stern whisper, "Please don't make a scene." The phrase hung in the air, a blade designed to cut Tiana down, to shame her into silence. A scene, as if demanding what was rightfully hers was a performance, as if her presence, her insistence on being treated with basic respect, was a disturbance to their comfortable, prejudiced world. The entire cabin went silent. The soft chatter died. The clinking of glasses stopped. Every eye was on her. She was on a stage she never asked to be on, the star of a play where she had been cast as the villain. Imagine walking into first class, ticket in hand, only to be told you don't belong because of the color of your skin. Would you stay quiet, or would you speak up? For a long moment, Tiana just stood there, letting the silence and the weight of their judgment wash over her. She could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck, the familiar sting of injustice. Her assistant looked on, his face pale with anxiety, ready to intervene, to argue, to do something. But Tiana gave him a look so subtle it was almost invisible, a slight shake of her head that said, "Stand down." Something shifted behind her eyes. It wasn't anger. Anger was a hot, messy emotion, and Tiana was anything but messy. It was a quiet, cold calculation. A switch had been flipped. She had played by the rules. She had been polite. She had presented evidence. And the system, embodied by this flight attendant and the arrogant man in her seat, had looked her in the eye and said, "The rules don't apply to you." So, Tiana decided she would play a different game. A game with different rules. Her rules. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead her case. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if accepting defeat. "All right," she said softly, her voice unreadable. She turned away from the flight attendant and the smirking man, making the other passengers think she was retreating, heading back toward the coach cabin with her tail between her legs. But she didn't walk down the aisle. Instead, she took one step back, reached into her expensive leather purse, and pulled out her phone. The flight attendant watched her, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. The man in seat 1A went back to his champagne, the matter now closed. They saw a woman who had been put in her place. But they weren't seeing the whole picture. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Tiana's fingers moved across the screen, not with anger, but with the calm, efficient precision of a surgeon. She wasn't looking up flight policies. She wasn't tweeting about her experience. She was pulling up a single number from her contacts, a number that didn't belong to a customer service agent. The name on the screen wasn't an airline representative. It was a name that could move mountains, a name that could make markets tremble. The flight attendant took a step forward, ready to scold her again for holding up the boarding process. "You need to," she began, her voice sharp with impatience. But she stopped. She stopped because Tiana looked up from her phone, her eyes locking onto the attendants. And for the first time, Tiana smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile that was all sharp edges and cold fire. A smile that promised not a scene, but a reckoning. It was the smile of a queen who was about to checkmate the entire board. Tiana's smile, cold and sharp, hung in the air for only a second, but it changed the entire dynamic of the cabin. It was a declaration of war that no one else understood. A few rows back, a young black woman named Kayla, on her first big work trip, had been watching the whole exchange with a knot tightening in her stomach. She'd seen this movie before, in different settings, with different actors, but always with the same script. She saw the casual dismissal, the weaponized politeness of the flight attendant, the smug entitlement of the man in seat 1A. But then she saw Tiana's smile, and it sparked something in her, not fear, but courage. Slipping her phone from her purse, she angled it just right, shielded by her jacket, and pressed record. "People need to see this," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of the aircraft. Her lens captured everything. The condescending smirk on Charles Denton's face, the flight attendant's rigid posture, and the unshakable, unnerving calm of the woman in the red suit. Just as Tiana was about to press the call button, the situation escalated. The flight attendant, Linda, clearly feeling she had lost control, had summoned her superior. A woman in her late 40s with a perfectly starched uniform and a clipped, authoritative voice marched down the aisle. This was the supervisor. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't look at Tiana's boarding pass. She arrived with a verdict already in her mind. Her gaze fell on Tiana, and her expression hardened. She had assessed the problem, and the problem, to her, was a black woman standing where she supposedly didn't belong. "Is there an issue here?" the supervisor asked, though the question was not for Tiana. It was for Linda and Charles, a show of solidarity. Linda launched into a rehearsed, one-sided explanation. "This passenger is refusing to cooperate. She's insisting this is her seat and is causing a disruption." Disruption. Refusing to cooperate. The corporate buzzwords were deployed like weapons, painting Tiana as an unruly agitator. The humiliation was no longer just a personal slight. It was becoming an official incident. Other passengers, sensing the heightened drama, now had their phones out, more openly filming. The whispers grew louder. "What is she trying to pull?" one man muttered. "Just go to the back of the plane." The supervisor turned to Tiana, her face a mask of professional impatience. "I've been advised of the situation. We have a flight to get off the ground. If you can't comply with the instructions of the cabin crew, we will have to remove you from this aircraft." There it was, the final threat, the ultimate humiliation, to be escorted off the plane like a criminal, in front of dozens of strangers, all because she had dared to claim what was hers. Tiana's assistant took a half-step forward, his mouth open to protest, but Tiana's eyes held him back. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She simply looked at the supervisor, at the flight attendant, at the man in her seat, and let their actions hang in the air, captured by at least half a dozen cameras. She knew that in a battle of perceptions, the person who loses their cool loses. With a profound and deliberate stillness, she lifted her phone. The supervisor watched, a look of annoyance on her face, assuming Tiana was calling a family member to complain. The supervisor sighed, her voice dripping with condescension. "That won't help you now." But it would. Tiana pressed the screen, and the call connected instantly. She brought the phone to her ear, her eyes never leaving the supervisor's. The cabin was dead silent, waiting for her to plead, to argue, to cry. Instead, she spoke 2 sentences, her voice as calm and clear as a winter morning. Her words were not for the supervisor, or the passengers, or anyone on that plane. They were for the person on the other end of the line, and they were an order that would detonate a bomb in the heart of the airline's corporate headquarters. "Jonathan, it's Tiana," she said. "Put the acquisition on hold. Effective immediately." The words, spoken with the calm authority of a general commanding an army, landed in the pressurized silence of the first-class cabin like a grenade. The supervisor froze, her mouth slightly open, the gears in her mind grinding to a halt. Acquisition. The word was a foreign object, a piece of jargon from a world she didn't inhabit. She tried to process it, to fit it into the neat little box of a difficult passenger scenario. Was it a threat? A bluff? Perhaps the woman was delusional, drunk on a sense of self-importance. The supervisor exchanged a look with the flight attendant, Linda, a look that communicated a shared, dismissive conclusion. This woman was unhinged. They had expected tears, or yelling, or desperate plea to a husband. They had been prepared for a scene. They were not prepared for this quiet, surgical strike of a sentence that hinted at a world of power they couldn't begin to comprehend. The man in seat 1A, Charles Denton, finally lowered his champagne glass, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his smug face for the first time. What game was this? Tiana ended the call and slipped the phone back into her expensive leather purse. She looked at the supervisor, her expression as placid and unreadable as a deep lake. "You wanted me removed from the aircraft," she said, her voice still a quiet, level line. "I'll wait in the gate area." Without another word, she turned. Her posture was perfect, her spine a rod of steel inside the red suit. Her assistant, whose face was now the color of chalk, scrambled to gather her briefcase and follow. They walked off the plane not in shame, but with the dignity of royalty, leaving a room full of peasants. They left a vacuum of utter confusion in their wake. As Tiana sat down in one of the cold, impersonal chairs of the waiting area, she was no longer a victim being ejected. She was a queen strategically retreating from the board, waiting for her opponent to realize they were already in checkmate. Her assistant started to whisper frantically, "Ms. Brooks, what are we?" But she silenced him with a single, steady look that said, "Watch and learn." And then, the ripples from her call began to reach the shore. The jet bridge, which should have been retracting with a decisive groan, remained stubbornly attached to the plane. The captain's voice, which had been in the middle of a cheerful announcement about their flight time to New York, cut off mid-sentence and never returned. An unsettling silence filled the aircraft, punctuated only by the anxious whispers of the passengers. Inside the cabin, the flight crew's professional smiles had vanished, replaced with tight, worried expressions as they spoke in hushed tones into their headsets, their eyes darting nervously towards the cockpit, then toward the gate where Tiana sat today. The passengers, a collection of the rich and important, were not used to unexplained delays. Their irritation began to simmer, then boil over. "What's the meaning of this?" a man in a pinstripe suit demanded. "I have a meeting in 2 hours." The supervisor, who had been a pillar of rigid authority just minutes before, now stood by the galley, twisting a piece of paper in her hands, utterly powerless. She was getting nothing but static from the captain and was pointedly avoiding the windows that looked out onto the woman who had somehow brought an entire passenger jet to a standstill. What no one on that plane knew was that a second, invisible tidal wave was building, far faster and more powerful than they could imagine. Miles away, in the chaotic, instantaneous world of the internet, Kayla's 60-second video clip was going supernova. Uploaded with the simple, damning hashtag #seat1A, it was a perfect viral storm of injustice. The video was raw, infuriating, and undeniably real. The first wave of outrage came from Black Twitter, where thousands of users instantly recognized the coded language, the dismissive gestures, the exhausting reality of navigating elite white spaces with a target on your back. From there, it exploded. Kayla watched in disbelief from her seat as the view count on her phone climbed at a dizzying rate. 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Her notifications were a blur. People were sharing their own stories. #airline racism started trending right alongside #seat1A. Celebrities, activists, and journalists with millions of followers were retweeting it, their captions dripping with fury. We've all seen racism play out in subtle ways. But this story, captured on a shaky phone camera, proved just how dangerous and humiliating that silence can be. The media, smelling blood in the water, pounced. In a bustling New York newsroom, a young social media editor saw the video, her eyes widening. "Get me everything on this," she yelled to her team. "Find out who she is." The airline's media relations department was completely unprepared for the onslaught. Their phones began ringing off the hook, their email inboxes flooded with inquiries from every major news outlet in the country. The company's social media accounts, usually a bland stream of travel deals, became a digital dumpster fire of angry comments, memes, and one-star reviews. Inside the airline's gleaming corporate headquarters in Chicago, the initial mood was one of arrogant dismissal. The first alerts on the internal communication channels were full of corporate jargon designed to minimize the problem. A non-compliant individual, an escalation handled by the book, a situation that was under control. In the executive boardroom, one VP scoffed, "Just another passenger trying to get a free upgrade. Release a statement about our commitment to customer experience and move on." Then, a junior PR assistant, tasked with the routine job of identifying the passenger for their official report, did a reverse image search on a screenshot from the viral video. The results that came back made her heart stop. her screen filled with pictures of Tiana Brooks ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange, headlines from Forbes and the Wall Street Journal about her recent billion-dollar federal contract, and articles naming her one of the most powerful new CEOs in America. The assistant's hands trembled as she typed a message into the executive channel, a message that cut through all the corporate noise like a siren. Urgent. Passenger in Seat 1A video has been identified as Tiana Brooks, CEO of Brooks Global Holdings. The name alone caused a jolt of panic that rippled through the boardroom. Tiana Brooks wasn't just some passenger. She was a corporate titan, a shark who had just devoured 3 of their competitors. The air in the room grew thin. Why was a person of her stature flying on their airline? And why in God's name was a video of their staff threatening to remove her from a flight being viewed by millions of people? But before they could even process the scale of that public relations disaster, a senior vice president in the finance department, a man who had been sitting silently in the corner, went pale. The name, Brooks Global, had triggered a horrifying connection in his mind. He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. The entire room fell silent, turning to look at him. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice hoarse. "Brooks Global, that's the firm. That's the firm we're in final acquisition negotiations with. The deal is worth hundreds of millions. She's not just a CEO. She's the one buying a controlling stake in this company." Detonation. Absolute, world-ending detonation. The woman their crew had humiliated, belittled, and threatened was in the process of becoming their new owner. The woman whose valid ticket they refused to honor held the fate of their entire 70-year-old company in her hands. The call Tiana had made suddenly made horrifying, cataclysmic sense. Put the acquisition on hold. It wasn't a bluff. It wasn't a threat. It was a kill switch. Back at Gate A17, Tiana sat scrolling through her phone, watching the hashtag with her name attached to it catch fire. She saw the news articles popping up, the headlines growing more sensational by the second. She saw the company's stock ticker, displayed on a nearby monitor, take its first nervous, sickening dip. The supervisor, now looking pale and physically ill, was getting frantic, garbled calls on her radio. She kept glancing out at Tiana, her former confidence completely shattered, replaced by a dawning, sickening dread. Suddenly, the supervisor's personal cell phone rang, shrill and piercing. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something primal in her gut told her she had to answer it. She put the phone to her ear, her hand trembling so badly she could barely hold it steady. "Hello." The voice on the other end was cold, furious, and belonged to the airline's chief of operations, calling from the corporate war room nearly 1,000 miles away. They couldn't hear his words, but they could see their effect. The supervisor's face drained of all color, leaving it a waxy, gray mask. Her eyes went wide with a terror so profound it was almost animalistic. Yes, sir," she stammered, her voice cracking. I didn't know. Oh God, I didn't know. I understand completely. Right away, sir." She hung up, her body rigid with shock, the phone slipping from her numb fingers and clattering to the floor. She turned and looked through the terminal window at Tiana, who met her gaze without a flicker of emotion. The look in the supervisor's eyes was no longer one of authority or annoyance. It was the look of someone staring at the person who had just single-handedly ended their career, their reputation, their entire world. At that exact moment, a loud, definitive hiss echoed through the gate as the main doors to the jet bridge slid open. But it wasn't the ground crew. The first thing they saw were the unmistakable polished black boots of airport security. 3 uniformed officers stepped into view, followed by 2 people in dark, severe suits, their faces grim, their walk radiating a level of authority that made the airline staff look like children. They weren't coming for Tiana. They were walking onto the plane. The arrival of the officials changed the air on the plane. It was as if the oxygen had been chemically altered, replaced with something heavy, metallic, and electric. The 5 of them, 3 uniformed airport police whose expressions were tired but firm, and 2 grim-faced individuals in dark suits that screamed federal authority, boarded the aircraft with a single-minded purpose that sucked all the sound out of the cabin. The passengers, who had been loudly complaining about their misconnections moments before, shrank back in their seats, the petulant annoyance instantly replaced by a primal, collective fear. This was no longer about a delay. This was an event. The very atmosphere had become a courtroom. The flight crew, especially the supervisor and Linda, looked as if they'd seen ghosts. Their faces, once masks of professional condescension, were now slack with disbelief and terror. Linda's hands, which had so confidently dismissed Tiana's boarding pass, were now trembling by her sides. The supervisor's mind was a frantic, useless whirlwind. Her training kicked in, a distant voice screaming protocols for hijackings, for medical emergencies, for disruptive passengers, but there was no protocol for this. There was no procedure for when you publicly humiliate a woman who can stop a plane with a phone call. They exchanged a single, fleeting glance, a silent, horrifying acknowledgement that they had tied their careers together and thrown them off a cliff. They were no longer airline employees in control. They were bystanders at a crash site they themselves had caused, waiting for the investigators to tell them how many lives they had destroyed, starting with their own. Inside the cabin, Charles Denton was experiencing a sensation entirely foreign to him: consequence. When he first heard Tiana's bizarre comment about an acquisition, he'd dismissed it as the rambling of a nobody. But then came the silence. Then the captain's aborted announcement. He felt a cold knot begin to form in his stomach. He discreetly tried to text the airline CEO, a man he played golf with, but the message wouldn't send. No signal. He felt a flicker of real panic, an emotion he typically only observed in his subordinates. One of the federal agents, a tall man with gray temples and eyes that had seen everything and were impressed by nothing, walked directly to the cockpit. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door, a clear violation of a dozen FAA regulations, and stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him. The passengers held their breath. Less than a minute later, the door opened, and the agent stepped out. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom system, and it had lost all its cheerful, welcoming warmth. Now, it was tense, formal, and laced with an anxiety he couldn't quite hide. "Ladies and gentlemen, a quick update for you," the captain said, his voice strained and tight. "Due to unforeseen circumstances, this aircraft has been officially grounded by the Federal Aviation Administration. We are experiencing an ongoing security situation, and we ask for your full cooperation. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts securely fastened. All movement in the cabin is prohibited. We will provide more information as it becomes available." Grounded. The word hit the cabin like a physical blow. A wave of shocked, fearful murmurs swept through the passengers. Grounded? By the FAA? Their eyes started darting around, looking for a threat, a reason. And then, slowly, collectively, their gazes drifted toward the windows, toward the gate area, where the woman in the red suit was now rising from her seat with impossible grace. The whispers started, connecting the dots in a chain reaction of dawning comprehension. It's because of that woman. What in the world did she do? No, a woman in seat 3B whispered to her husband, her phone still recording. What did they do to her? And then, the ultimate power shift began, a moment of cinematic justice so perfect it felt scripted. The main door to the aircraft was still open, and two figures appeared at the entrance of the jet bridge. One was the airport's general manager, a man whose face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The other was the second federal agent. And walking calmly between them, flanked like a head of state on her way to a summit, was Tiana Brooks. She stepped back onto the plane, and the world tilted on its axis. The first time she'd walked down this aisle, she was an object of suspicion, her presence questioned by every sideways glance. Now, her every step landed in a pool of stunned, gaping silence. The click-clack of her heels on the cabin floor was the only sound. Her red suit seemed to absorb all the light, glowing with an aura of untouchable authority. The wealthy businessman in 2C who had openly smirked at her was now staring intently at a stain on his trousers. The couple who had chuckled when Denton called her sweetheart were now holding hands in a white-knuckled grip, unable to watch. She didn't look at any of them. Her focus was singular, her path direct. She was a weapon seeking its target. The supervisor, jolted out of his stupor by the terrifying sight of Tiana, rushed forward, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim some semblance of control. Ms. Brooks, there's been a terrible misunderstanding, she stammered, her voice cracking, her words tumbling out in a useless, sycophantic heap. We are so sorry for the experience. If you'll just let us explain. Tiana didn't even glance at her. She simply raised a hand, a quiet, almost lazy gesture that nonetheless carried the force of a physical wall. The supervisor's pathetic apology died in her throat, choked off by the sheer, dismissive power of that simple movement. Tiana stopped right beside the seat. Charles Denton, the man who had patronized her, the man who had symbolized every dismissive gatekeeper she had ever faced, was now a broken figure. All the color had drained from his face, leaving it pasty and blotched with fear. A sheen of cold sweat glistened on his forehead. His hand, which had held his champagne flute with such arrogant steadiness, now trembled on the armrest. He looked up at her, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by the terrified, pleading look of a man who knows his life is over and is begging for a quick death. A hush so profound fell over the cabin that you could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the grounded engines. Tiana looked down at him, not with rage, but with a kind of detached, final judgment. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, quiet, and carried to every corner of the silent plain, a perfect instrument of vengeance. Mr. Denton, she said, the name spoken with cold precision. I believe you in my seat. Again. It was the most devastatingly polite execution anyone had ever witnessed. At that moment, the two airport security officers moved forward, their movements crisp and efficient. One of them addressed the man, and in doing so, dropped the second bombshell of the day, delivering it like a prosecutor reading an indictment to a stunned jury. Charles Denton, Chief Operating Officer for this airline, the officer said, his voice loud and clear for all to hear. We need you to come with us. Please gather your personal belongings. Chief Operating Officer. The words sent another shockwave through the first-class cabin. It was one thing to see a rich passenger be humbled. It was another thing entirely to watch a god of this gilded world be struck down from his throne. The man who had stolen her seat, the man who had treated her like garbage, wasn't just another arrogant passenger. He was one of the most powerful executives in the entire company. The injustice wasn't just a rogue employee. It was rotten from the very top. The systemic failure was now laid bare for everyone to see. Charles Denton stood up on shaky legs, fumbling with his briefcase. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. He was drowning in a sea of his own making. The cameras from a dozen different cell phones were now pointed directly at him, their lenses like a firing squad, recording his walk of shame for digital eternity. The smirk was gone. The Rolex was meaningless. The entitlement had evaporated, leaving only a hollowed-out man being publicly humiliated. As he was led down the aisle, he stumbled, bumping hard into an armrest. The flash from a phone went off, illuminating the pathetic beads of sweat on his upper lip. The flight crew, Linda and the supervisor, stood like statues of salt, their faces etched with the horrifying realization that their own fates were inexorably tied to his. As security escorted him off the plane, a disgraced king being frog-marched out of his own castle, Tiana Brooks finally sat down in seat 1A. She placed her purse on the empty seat beside her and smoothed the front of her suit. Her assistant, standing in the aisle, let out a long, shuddering breath he seemed to have been holding for the entire ordeal. The atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. It was no longer tense, it was reverent. Tiana was no longer just a passenger. She was the gravitational center of the entire crisis, the quiet authority around which everything now revolved. She didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply turned her head and looked out the window at the flashing lights of the airport vehicles now surrounding the aircraft, as if this was exactly how she had expected the day to unfold all along. The lead federal agent, the one with the gray temples, walked back down the aisle. The passengers watched him, their own fate still hanging in the balance. He stopped, leaning down to speak to Tiana quietly, his voice a low, respectful murmur. But in the dead silence of the cabin, his words carried, intended for her ears but heard by all. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "the FAA is on standby. The Secretary of Transportation has been briefed. This airline is facing a full federal investigation for discriminatory practices and potential civil rights violations, starting with the immediate suspension of the entire crew and senior management involved in this incident." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His eyes met Hayes, and he asked the question that held the entire future of the airline in the balance. "The federal machine is ready to move on your command. We just need your official word on how you'd like to proceed. What do you want us to do?" The federal agent's question hung in the silent, pressurized air of the cabin. "What do you want us to do?" It was a question of immense power, an offer of total, unmitigated revenge. The entire federal machine was waiting for her command. The passengers, the crew, her own assistant, everyone leaned in, expecting a verdict. Fire them, sue them, ruin them. This was her moment to demand a head on a platter, and everyone felt she had earned it. But Tiana Brooks didn't build a billion-dollar empire by thinking small. She didn't get to the top by being predictable. She looked at the agent, her gaze calm and steady, and gave a reply that no one saw coming. "I don't want a statement," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want a meeting with the airline's board of directors and with your superiors from the Department of Transportation within the hour." The agent blinked, surprised by the sheer audacity and strategic brilliance of the demand. This wasn't about revenge. This was a corporate takeover happening at 30,000 feet. An hour later, the scene had shifted from the tense drama of the grounded aircraft to the cold, sterile environment of an emergency conference room in the airport's executive wing. Outside the frosted glass doors, a swarm of reporters and news cameras created a frenzy of flashing lights, their lenses pressed against the glass like hungry sharks. Inside, the atmosphere was funereal. The airline's board members, a gallery of grim-faced, older white men, appeared on a large monitor via an emergency video conference, their expressions a mixture of terror and disbelief. In the room sat two high-ranking officials from the Department of Transportation, their faces impassive. And at the head of the long, polished table, in her fiery red suit, sat Tiana. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She was the judge, the jury, and the executioner, all in one. The airline's chairman of the board, a man named Sterling, began with a pathetic, groveling apology. He spoke of a deeply regrettable incident, of isolated actions not representative of their values, and of the swift and decisive disciplinary action they were prepared to take. "Ms. Brooks," he pleaded, "we are prepared to terminate the employment of every single individual involved, from the chief operating officer down to the gate agent. Effective immediately. We just want to make this right." He was offering her exactly what the world expected her to take. He was offering her blood. The audience in the room, and the millions watching the story unfold online, were holding their breath. What would you do? When the people who humiliated you are served up on a silver platter, do you take your pound of flesh? Tiana let the offer hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. She looked at the panicked faces on the screen, at the stone-faced officials beside her. Then, she leaned forward. "I don't want heads," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "I want change." A confused silence fell over the room. "Firing Mr. Denton and a few flight attendants is easy," she continued, her voice gaining power. "It's a neat and tidy PR solution that allows you all to issue a press release and go back to business as usual. But this wasn't about one arrogant man or one biased flight attendant. This was about a corporate culture, a system that made them feel comfortable, empowered, and justified in their actions. You have a disease in this company, Mr. Sterling, and firing a few sick employees doesn't cure the disease. It just hides the symptoms until the next outbreak." She had transformed the room from a disciplinary hearing into a masterclass on leadership. She wasn't just a victim. She was a visionary. "So here's what's going to happen," Tiana stated, laying out her terms not as requests, but as decrees. "First, you will implement mandatory, comprehensive anti-bias and de-escalation training for every single employee, from the boardroom to the baggage handlers. And that training program will be designed and implemented by a fame of my choosing. The board members nodded frantically. Second, she went on, you will rewrite your passenger conduct policies. You will create zero-tolerance clauses that explicitly protect both customers and staff from discrimination of any kind, with clear and severe consequences. This is not just about protecting me. It's about protecting the next person who looks like me. And third, she concluded, her eyes locking onto the chairman's, while I am not demanding their termination today, Mr. Denton and the flight supervisor are to be suspended, effective immediately, pending a full and transparent accountability review. The results of that review will be made public. It was a brilliant move. She had secured the public shaming and punishment the audience craved, but framed it as a step towards systemic reform, not personal vengeance. The airline, desperate to staunch the bleeding, agreed to everything without a moment's hesitation. Later that day, they released a public apology. It was a masterpiece of corporate contrition, promising sweeping changes and deep introspection. What the public didn't know was that every single word of it had been written by Tiana's own public relations team. She didn't just win the battle. She was now dictating the terms of the surrender. As Tiana and her assistant finally walked through a private terminal toward a car she had summoned, the immediate crisis seemed to be over. Justice, it appeared, had been served, not with a guillotine, but with a scalpel. But the story wasn't finished. Her assistant, who had been quietly working on his laptop throughout the meeting, hurried to catch up with her. Ms. Brooks, he said, his voice low and urgent. While they were dealing with the press, I had our legal team run a deep background check on Charles Denton. There's something else. Something I don't think the board knows. Something you need to see. He held out his tablet. Tiana stopped walking and took it. On the screen was a heavily redacted legal document from over 20 years ago. Her eyes scanned the page, and then they froze. She zoomed in on a single line of text, a line that made the entire incident on the plane feel like something other than a random act of prejudice. A line that suggested this might not have been a coincidence at all. It was a record of a workplace discrimination complaint filed against a young Charles Denton at his very first job out of college. And the name of the man who had filed it was a name Tiana knew better than her own. Her late father. The revelation about her father had changed everything. The incident was no longer a random, ugly encounter with a stranger. It was an echo from the past, a ghost from her family's history showing up in the first-class cabin. For days, Tiana was haunted by it. The victory felt hollow, the public justice incomplete. The world saw a powerful CEO who had brought an airline to its knees. She saw a painful connection to the man her father had fought and lost to decades ago. Then came the request. Charles Denton, now the disgraced former COO of the airline, stripped of his title and his dignity, was desperately trying to secure a meeting. Her team advised against it. There's nothing to gain, her lawyers said. Let him fade into obscurity. But Tiana knew this wasn't finished. There was one last piece of the puzzle she needed to put in place. She agreed to see him. He arrived at her office not as the smug executive from the plane, but as a ghost of his former self. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. His face was pale and drawn, and the arrogance in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, hollowed-out shame. He sat opposite her magnificent desk, a small, broken man dwarfed by the symbols of her success, the very success her father had dreamed of. He apologized for what happened on the plane, his voice raspy and sincere. Then, he took a deep breath and addressed the real reason he was there. I knew who you were, Ms. Brooks, he confessed, his eyes fixed on his hands. Not at first, but when I saw your name on the acquisition paperwork weeks ago. I knew. I remembered your father. He told a story of being a young, ambitious man in a cutthroat corporate world, a world that rewarded aggression and punished decency. He admitted that he had played a part in pushing Tiana's father out of the company, a choice he claimed had haunted him for years. When I saw you on that plane, he continued, his voice cracking, so powerful, so successful, all I could see was him. It felt like a reckoning. I panicked. What I did, it was a pathetic, ugly attempt to feel powerful in a moment when I felt anything but. It was a moment for vengeance. Here was the man who had wronged her family, delivered to her doorstep, begging for some kind of absolution. What would you do if the person who hurt your family was finally powerless before you? Do you grant them the grace they never showed? Or do you make them pay for the sins of the past? Tiana listened to his entire story, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the office. It was never about the seat, Mr. Denton, she finally said, her voice soft but clear. Not for me, and not for my father. It was about who people think deserves one. Then, and now. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city her father had dreamed of conquering. I don't forgive you for what you did to my father, she said, her back still to him. That's not mine to give. But the cycle of bitterness ends today. It ends with me. She turned to face him. Your apology is accepted. It wasn't forgiveness as weakness. It was forgiveness as the ultimate form of control. She was refusing to let his past actions define her future. Their handshake was brief and formal, yet it became a symbolic image that news outlets would splash across their pages, calling it reconciliation at 30,000 feet. Days later, Tiana stood on the stage at a global business summit, the spotlight shining on her as she addressed a captivated audience of thousands. She didn't speak about the incident itself, but about the nature of power. We've been taught to believe that power is loud, she said, her voice resonating through the auditorium. That it's about shouting the loudest, being the most aggressive person in the room. But that's not power. That's fear. She paused, letting her words sink in. Real power doesn't scream, she concluded. It simply moves, and the world adjusts. The applause was deafening. As she walked off stage, her speech already going viral, her assistant rushed to her side, his face beaming with an excitement she hadn't seen before. Ms. Brooks, it's working, he said, handing her a tablet. The reforms. The quarterly report from the airline just came in. Tiana looked at the screen. It was a series of statistics and internal metrics, but one section was highlighted. Since the implementation of the new anti-bias training program she had designed, employee-reported incidents of discrimination had dropped by an astonishing 92%. But that wasn't all. Below that was a list of recent promotions. For the first time in the airline's 8-year history, 3 black women had been promoted to senior captain and executive positions. Tiana's eyes scanned the names, and then they stopped on one. Captain Kayla Washington, the young woman who had filmed the video. The name on the tablet, Captain Kayla Washington, was more than just a promotion. It was proof. It was the first tangible fruit from a tree planted in the toxic soil of humiliation. Tiana looked at the report, at the incredible, almost unbelievable statistics of positive change, and for the first time since that day in Dallas, a genuine, unguarded smile touched her lips. She hadn't just won a battle. She had redrawn the entire map, burning the old one for fuel. 6 months later, the world could see the difference. The acquisition was complete. The airline was reborn, not just rebranded. Tiana had insisted on it. A new commercial flooded the airwaves, a masterpiece of cinematic storytelling that never showed the planes. Instead, it showed faces, a young black girl with braids looking out a window in wonder, a flight attendant compassionately helping an elderly passenger, a ground crew member of color laughing with his colleagues. The voiceover, smooth and calm, was Tiana's. This isn't an airline, she said. It's a promise that every journey matters, and every person deserved to arrive at their destination with their dignity intact. The changes were bone deep. The multi-million-dollar scholarship fund for aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities, named after her father, sent out its first round of acceptance letters. In a small apartment in Houston, a young woman who had dreamed of flying since she was a child stared at the letter, tears streaming down her face. The future she thought was locked away now wide open before her. Tiana's mandated reforms had become the airline's new religion. The anti-bias training she designed was now the industry gold standard, a rigorous, unflinching program that forced employees into uncomfortable but necessary conversations about race, power, and perception. Her influence bled beyond her own balance sheets. In a stuffy, wood-paneled room in Washington, D.C., Tiana sat before a congressional subcommittee, chairing the first meeting of the new FAA Advisory Council on Racial Equity. The room was a sea of skeptical, aging faces from the old guard, men who ran airlines and lobbying firms, who saw her not as a visionary but as a disruption. For decades, the aviation industry has operated under the guise of operational necessity and random selection, Tiana said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of steel. Let me be clear, what happened to me was not random. And the only operational necessity is the one we are creating today, the necessity of human decency. We will create a new set of rules. And for those who refuse to play by them, know this. Your airlines exist because passengers grant you their trust. We can, and we will, teach them to take it back. The threats were veiled, but the message was clear. The old ways were over. Adapt or become a fossil. One crisp autumn afternoon, Tiana boarded a flight to New York. The experience was a world away from her last trip. As she walked down the jet bridge, she was no longer an anonymous black woman to be questioned. The gate agent smiled warmly, greeting her by name. When she stepped onto the aircraft, she was met not by a suspicious flight attendant, but by the pilot herself, standing proudly at the door of the cockpit. It was Captain Kayla Washington. The young woman's eyes shone with a profound, heartfelt gratitude. Her new uniform was immaculate, the 4 gold stripes on her epaulets gleaming. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her voice steady and professional, yet filled with emotion. "Welcome aboard. It's an honor to have you on my flight." "The honor is all mine, Captain," Tiana replied, shaking her hand firmly. "I just want to say thank you," Kayla said quietly, so only Tiana and her assistant could hear. "Not just for the promotion. You changed the weather in here. Last week, I had a passenger, a man who didn't like taking orders from a black woman. He made a comment. The old me would have had to swallow it, smile, and de-escalate to protect my own career. But the new me..." Kayla's lips curved into a confident smile. The new me informed him of the airline's zero-tolerance policy, had him met by security upon landing, and had his frequent flyer status permanently revoked. I didn't have to second-guess myself for a single moment. I knew the company had my back. She paused, the weight of her next words heavy with meaning. "You have no idea what it's like to finally be able to just fly." Tiana simply nodded, a universe of shared understanding passing between them in that single gesture. She walked down the aisle to her seat, 1A, and settled in. As the plane pushed back from the gate, its powerful engines spooling up, Tiana looked out the window at the world shrinking below. She remembered the feeling of utter powerlessness in that same aisle, the hot sting of humiliation, the cold weight of injustice. It felt like another lifetime. She thought of her father, of his quiet dignity in the face of 1,000 daily slights. He had fought his battles in silence, behind closed doors, and had the scars to prove it. She had been forced to fight hers in the open, with the whole world watching. When they tried to ground her, she grounded their entire system, and then she taught it how to rise. The story of Flight 227 became a modern legend, a symbol of a new kind of power. A montage of the new reality played out across the world. News headlines no longer talked about the scandal. They talked about the airline's record-breaking customer satisfaction scores and its soaring profits. Young women of color on social media, aspiring entrepreneurs and future leaders, posted videos of themselves in sharp business suits, quoting her speech like scripture, "Real power doesn't scream. It simply moves, and the world adjusts." A quick shot in a news report showed Charles Denton, in a simple orange vest, picking up trash on the side of a highway as part of his community service, his face humbled and anonymous. Another showed the airline's new board of directors, once a monochrome portrait of the old guard, now a vibrant mosaic of faces, genders, and backgrounds, a true reflection of the world they served. The final shot of the montage was a news anchor in Tokyo speaking in Japanese, with a graphic of Tiana's face next to the words, "The Brooks Method, a new model for corporate accountability." Power doesn't shout, it calls. Tiana Brooks had the power, the resources, and the platform to make them listen. Her story gives us hope and a deep, satisfying sense of justice. But it also leaves you with one final, haunting question. What about all the voices that don't own the airline? What about the people who can't make a single phone call and bring a corporation to its knees? Who listens to them when the doors close and the cameras are off? Like this video to stand for respect. Share to start a conversation. And subscribe to join our movement, ensuring that no voice is ever silenced again.